welcome back to the Sad Dad Games podcast. This is another episode of Eric's Indie Corner, a time where I, Eric, get to talk about some of my favorite games. So, introducing myself, I'm Eric.
I'm Shan.
I'm Tucker.
Right, like I said, this is a time where I get to talk about some of my favorite indie games. I use it as an excuse to either talk about indie games that all of us have played together, or as a platform to try to convince Shan and Tucker to play indie games that I have played that they haven't, but I love and I think everyone should play. So today the indie game that we're talking about is Bloodstained, Curse of the Moon, which is a very cool 8-bit 2D action platformer, very much in the style of like old school Castlevania. So it was developed by Inti Creates, and it released on May 24th of 2018. Something really cool about Bloodstained is it was released as like a Kickstarter. Like it was a stretch goal for a Kickstarter. So Koji Igarashi, who is one of the main producers of old school Castlevania games like he's very famously one of the producers for Symphony of the Night, which is everyone's like go-to favorite Castlevania game. Very, very, it's like the game that lends the Vania part to the Metroidvania genre. It was one of the very first Metroidvania games. And so it's a big deal. Koji Igarashi, very cool guy. And he left, I'm blanking on the name, Konami. He left Konami a while back and started a Kickstarter for a game called Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. And one of the stretch goals for that was a smaller companion game, which is what we're going to be talking about today, Bloodstained Curse of the Moon, which is like an 8-bit old school Castlevania inspired game. Very cool stuff. So have either of you guys, do you have much experience with Castlevania as a series? Or
my only experience is in college watching you play some old Castlevania games. I think on like the Xbox 360 arcade or something like that. Maybe it was on the Wii U. Yeah,
it could have been either one of those. I am a big fan of, I played Castlevania games mostly like I started on the Game Boy Advance and the DS. I played like Aria of Sorrow, Dawn of Sorrow, Portrait of Ruin. Those were kind of my jam. But just recently, I've been kind of getting into a jam of wanting to play some old school Castlevania games, which made me want to revisit Bloodstained Curse of the Moon as well, because it plays and looks and feels basically like an 8-bit Castlevania game. And what a lot of people might not know is that Castlevania, before it was like these big sprawling maps, like open Metroidvania style games, is they were just kind of linear platformers. Castlevanias 1 through 4 were really just like level 1, level 2, you go through and you fight monsters on the way to Dracula's castle and fight through Dracula's castle, and then at the end you fight Dracula. They're all very linearly structured, and it's just about killing monsters and fighting to get to Dracula. And so Bloodstained Curse of the Moon is very much in that vein of games. You play as a in the castle vein.
In the castle vein.
We did it. We punned.
Yeah, nailed it.
First try. Episode over. Shan, peak humor. We can just stop here.
It's the only thing I've added to this episode so far. But it was perfect.
Well, you gotta when the pun presents itself, you gotta jump in and you pun. I
sit back and I wait for my moment, and I struck.
It's like a cobra. Waits for the comedy opportunities.
Or as Chandler Bing would do, whoop-pa!
Whoop-pa! So I lost my train of thought now. So Bloodstained is you play as a lone swordsman named Zangetsu, which is a very cool guy name. His name is Zangetsu. He's a swordsman, and he is on a mission to get revenge upon the demons who have cursed him. He's got a terrible curse placed upon him by some very mean, nasty demons. And along the way, he meets some friends, other playable characters. So you play as Zangetsu, and there are other characters that you can unlock and play as you go throughout the journey. You get to the end of certain levels, and then you unlock a new character, and they have slightly different abilities and can kind of mix up the gameplay. One of them jumps a little higher and has a wider or like a longer attack range. One of them is like a wizard and can cast spells that do different things. One of them is like a kind of a vampire character who can turn into a bat, so you can reach different areas once you unlock him. But and then he flies away. Yeah, why did we spend the other we recorded a Pokemon episode earlier, and we spent like half of it talking about what we do in the shadows, when clearly this would have been the perfect time to talk about what we do in the shadows. Missed opportunity.
We could talk about it again.
We can talk about it again. And What We Do in the Shadows is an excellent vampire mockumentary TV show, and it's very funny, and it just gets me in a vampire-y mood.
I don't think they've ever oversaturated mockumentaries enough. Like that formula will always
I never get
work
tired
for me.
of it.
Maybe it's just a millennial thing, and that was like the height of sitcom in history. But just like you get The Office, Parks, and I guess they stopped it for Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And then What We Do in the
Abbott
Shadows.
Elementary is a new one.
Modern Family did it.
Modern Family kind of. Yeah. I think
It's like a normal show, but with
heads.
talking heads. Yeah.
Yeah. The reason it works for me is because it's like the editing. It's all in the editing. It's how they can just like undercut a moment with just like an insert. And like that always like punches up the editing to like really nail the timing of jokes instead of hoping that you caught it in post while you're like pulling things together. Like you can usually make things work that way, but when you just have somebody undercutting it with like a talking head, that it's a shortcut, but it's very effective. It makes the laughs so much louder.
So now for, I don't know, maybe depending on when they air, like 2 episodes in a row, we're going to plug What We Do in the Shadows. It's a funny show. Go watch it. It's like a mockumentary about vampires. It's particularly hilarious to have like something so fantastical and weird. And then there's just like a mockumentary crew following a bunch of vampires around. Very funny. So anyways, vampires, demons, Zangetsu, murder, Castlevania. It all circles back. Bats. So it all loops back into Bloodstained, where it all ties back together. So the gameplay is very much reminiscent of old school Castlevania, almost to like a fault. You know, it's extremely similar. I wouldn't say to a fault, but it's if you're craving old school Castlevania, Bloodstained gets the job done. It's basically just an old school Castlevania game, but with not technically Castlevania characters.
So like a spiritual successor.
Spiritual successor. It's very, very much that. Yeah. And even the graphics and the music are very similar. One thing that I do like about the structure of this game is that it's not a very long game. It's about 2 hours to get through like a playthrough, but once you complete a playthrough, you can take the characters that you unlocked before, and then you can access different areas in earlier levels where you wouldn't have had those characters before, and it affects the endings and stuff. And so really to get the full story of the game, you can play through like three to 5 times, I think, play through the game. And then you can kind of see all of the story and you get different changes here and there. And so it's like each time you play through, there are little differences and it gets mixed up just a little bit based on the characters that you have and the things that happen. And so they do a good job of kind of incentivizing you to replay, but mixing up the story mode so that it's not exactly the same every single time. So that's a lot of fun. It adds a lot of replay value and a reason to replay the game beyond just like, oh, I want to play this game again, you know?
So would you say there is a little bit of a Metrovania aspect into that of different characters unlock different areas?
Not really, because the areas it's still fairly linear. Like once you get, like, for example, in like the first level, there will be a ledge up high that you can't reach. But then once you beat the game once, you come back with guy who can be a bat, and then guy who can be a bat can reach that ledge and go through that door. Bat. he goes bat, and then he can fly up that ledge, and you go through a door, and then that's the new pathway. It's not like a different area that you can freely explore. It's like a different
like the upper
pathway.
path in Sonic
Yes.
games.
Yeah, it's kind of more like that. So it unlocks new pathways rather than like a larger like map that you can explore. But I find it very rewarding. It's super fun to play. Really, really enjoy that aspect of it. So yeah. So also being able to play as the 4 different characters is really fun. You can swap between these characters really anytime you want. That adds a lot of like gameplay wrinkles where you can be like, one of the characters jumps a little bit higher. And so if you're having some difficulty with platforming challenges, you're like, well, maybe I'll be the character who jumps a little bit higher, you know, obvious thing like that. But also they act kind of as like a lives system. So if you go into a level with 4 characters and then you die as one of those characters, then you have to go back to the last checkpoint and then you only have the other 3 characters. And so it kind of acts like a a story contextualized like continue system. And so it also gives you this kind of like reservation where if you know a character maybe will be really helpful against the boss at the end of the level, then you might not want to use them, even though they'd make the platforming part easier or this other part easier. You might want to save them for the boss, because if they accidentally die before you get to the boss, then that's a bummer. And so it's this cool, like it adds this organic decision making on the fly about what characters to use and when to use them and why you're using them. And so very fun.
Did they ever do that for a Ninja Turtles game? I can't remember. It feels familiar.
They did. There was a Ninja Turtles game that is actually a Metroidvania game that released on the original Game Boy that it released on the original Game Boy.
He was extremely poor, so he thought
and
they were Game Boys.
Game Boys, yeah, you can't afford them. But it was called Ninja Turtles
Sega Drink. Yeah,
it's called Ninja Turtles Radical Rescue.
Gear.
Radical Rescue. But so yeah, you would die as a turtle and you get to choose another turtle. You can't play as the same one. Was that what
well, all of the arcade games had something kind of like that, where you could most of the arcade games, if you died as whatever turtle, then you'd come back as a different turtle or another, or you could choose another turtle.
Okay, that's what I was remembering.
Yeah, but there actually is another Metroidvania for the Game Boy called Radical Rescue. That's a pretty cool game. So yeah, it's cool back and forth characters. And speaking of like going and fighting the bosses in this game are so cool. They're incredibly creative, just design wise. They're always these weird kind of twisted monsters or interesting kind of like character. I don't want to spoil them for you, but the bosses are all very cool and they're very fun to fight. And they do a good job of, for the first little while, accenting the abilities of whatever character you might have got at the beginning of that level. So bosses are another big highlight. They're a big spectacle, particularly for a game that's inspired by like 8-bit NES graphics in that era. They're bigger and larger than life than you'd expect from something like that.
Well, what's interesting is like the mixture of these bosses, because it's like sometimes you get some Lovecraftian and like this one kind of looks cyberpunky that I'm looking at, but not really. Like it's a mixture of ideas, but like brought together by a design style and choice. So, and it's got dragons, so it's like it's fantasy based too. So it's pulling a little bit from different genres to make its own thing, and that's really cool.
Yeah, they all feel very creative, and some of them make appearances as well in the larger game. So, like I said toward the beginning of the episode, Curse of the Moon was like a stretch goal for the larger game, which is like a Metroidvania, a spiritual successor to games like Symphony of the Night. The larger game being called Ritual of the Night, and that one, some of the bosses and characters make an appearance in Ritual of the Night as well, which is pretty cool. And so you get to see them in like a larger 3D form, and then also in like these 8-bit styles graphics, which is very cool. And Ritual of the Night is also another cool game that we'll end up covering on a different indie episode probably. But feeling a little more, old school Castlevania has kind of been my jam lately. So that's what made me think about this. But yeah, so we've talked a little bit about it as we've gone, but visuals and sound are really great as well. Nice chunky pixels, 8-bit graphics. I really like when a game tries to emulate the visual style of the suit, like the NES era, because I think that those like deep blacks and the really saturated colors just invoke this nostalgia in me, where it's like, even though this is a newer indie game that came out, in the not too distant past, 2018, not that far away, it feels like a game that I would have played when I was a kid, just because of that color palette. Like the NES had such a distinct color palette and a way that they used colors. They could only have so many colors on screen at the time because of the hardware limitations of the NES. And so when making retro games like this, the developers being really particular about how they use those colors, and it's like, well, we have X amount of colors that we can use on the screen at a time, and it just makes it feel nostalgic and old, even though it's not nostalgic or old.
Yeah, I love when like design wise, creatively, they can use contrast colors that like aren't tonally accurate but like are vibrant and contrasting, because it just has to have such a specific intentionality behind it, and it just like elevates the style of it. And so this almost like has like a dark fantasy, almost sci-fi like aesthetic to it. Like I can't really pin it down. I'm not finding the right words for it, but it's just like, but I love, it's like colors that you don't expect being juxtaposed together, and it makes everything just like really pop on screen.
Yeah, I'd agree. It has some kind of like slightly sci-fi vibes, but I'd say it's more like a high fantasy mixed with some old school campy horror is kind of the vibes that I get from this game artistically and just in general. It kind of scratch like Wolfman, Frankenstein kind of stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it looks like I don't know, it feels very like those old just HTML colors that are just like green, blue, and they're just like this terrible.
What color is this?
Blue.
Green. Yeah.
And it's just like this like terrible kind of neonish that hurts your eyes.
The royal blue of the original, it's still like default blue, right? But like nobody uses it because it's abhorrent to look at, except for like hyperlinks on the default HTML page. That'll be the default color for them. Nobody uses that. They'll switch it out immediately. Like these colors are almost painful to look at, but in the right context, deeply nostalgic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It just, like I said, like I said earlier, it makes me feel like I'm playing a game that I could have played when I was a kid. And I've always been a big fan of that NES color palette. I think it's just, it scratches an itch for me that I really like. Yeah.
Yeah, but okay, so this is an interesting thing about like what I've seen about the design and the colors. Yes, they're probably technically limiting themselves in ways that would be faithful to the NES era, but then what's interesting are the ways that they choose to ignore it, to elevate the art. And so it's like, okay, well, sprites could never have been this big, or they the HUD couldn't have looked like this, or like but like at the same time, like the character that you control, that looks very faithful. He moves in an original way that NES characters would move. So it's like the things that they choose to make faithful and the things they choose to abandon to elevate it. So it's almost like how you think you remember these games as a kid, but it's not accurate.
No, it's exactly that. I mean, things like there's a lot of parallax scrolling, which isn't something that they could really do in the NES without a lot of workarounds and technical wizardry. And really large sprites for the bosses is not something that was possible on the NES. But they do things like that to make the bosses feel larger than life and to feel really imposing. And so they have these really large, intricate sprites that just wouldn't have been possible in that era. But like Shan said, they break those conventions in order to elevate those moments. And it feels nostalgic but new at the same time.
Yeah, the density of these textures or these characters, the art on them, it's like, okay, you go back and you play Metroid NES, like nothing is this detailed. It is pretty flat. It is very like not monotone, but it's just like it's very repetitive and
lots of reused tiles and
exactly. They couldn't even use that many tiles on the screen at one time, right? Like I'm guessing 8 because it was 8-bit or something. I don't. Or just like there was a limitation to like how many.
Not a lot. The answer is not a lot. Yeah.
And it's like, okay, clearly they threw that out so that they can have although like simple blocky textures, there's more going on than you could have ever had on the original system.
Yeah, it feels kind of to me like Metroid Fusion. It was kind of that perfect blend of you have these very pixelated things, but then you have these more kind of larger than life bosses. And I think the Game Boy Advance kind of set in that perfect era.
It could do both.
It could do both. Of detail. Well, in the Game Boy Advance had the advantage of being able to use lots of different colors all at once. But they do have that, like these much larger sprites that could really animate more expressively and take up most of the screen and be more imposing that way. So 100%.
How great was the Game Boy Advance in that?
It's like Game Boy Advance.
Because like we got NES, we got Super Nintendo, and then we jumped to N64, and the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance just kept going for a little time. So it's like, even though the console is jumping ahead technically, they're like, well, these handhelds, we're jumping ahead, but we're gonna force you to like the parameters of the consoles of a previous generation. So what can you do with that creative box, but with like a few extra toys at your that you can play around with. And so it's like it forced them to go back and confine themselves and be more creative. So Game Boy Advance unleashed some of the greatest games I've ever played.
It really a huge Game Boy Advance fan. That was the first handheld I was allowed to buy. I had to like bribe my parents in order for them, and they didn't even get me a Game Boy Advance. I had to do something for them, and then I earned the right to purchase myself a Game Boy Advance. And because they didn't want me to have them before, justifiably, they were like, no, you'll play it in all hours of the night. And I was like, no, I won't. And then I totally did. So they were 100% correct in their assessment of you shouldn't have a Game Boy Advance.
And Game Boy Advance was going along up until GameCube era, because there were games where you could like...
that used the connector thing.
Use connector.
Plug your Game Boy Advance as a controller into the game.
So cool.
That's so good.
Glorious.
Four Swords Adventures.
Yeah.
I think that's probably one of the most
Not
creative
but-
games of that era was Four Swords.
Yes.
Just how you can play it with multiple people. Like,
I'd love to get a GameCube.
Multiplayer handheld game.
I would love to get a GameCube and like Game Boy Advances and just sit down with like 3 friends and play that whole game. That's my dream. I would love that.
Yeah. And Wind Waker also had like compatibility things with like A Link to the Past.
With the Tingle Tuner, yeah.
Tingle Tuner, I used that a lot.
It wasn't a lot of things, but there was like Pokemon games, there was a Stadium one I think that could connect with some of the Pokemon.
N64,
Stadium was N64. There was some that could connect, like Pokemon something. There was a Pokemon something on the GameCube that could connect with the Game Boy games that way. I think I might be remembering that wrong,
but I haven't played it.
Oh, that's what I was thinking of. Not Stadium, Pokemon Coliseum, I think. Yeah, so there was all sorts of fun stuff. So Game Boy Advance, super cool, really reminiscent of that kind of era of gaming, of being kind of retroly confined, but feeling new and fresh, like with new ideas is a very cool thing to me, which is one of the reasons why I love indie games so much, because a lot of developers, they make retro inspired games, but with like current gaming landscape sensibilities. And so they feel new and old at the same time. And it's the sweet spot for me. I love it. Yeah,
speaking of which, we backed Mina the Hollower. And that's going to be by the Shovel Knight developers.
Yacht Club Games.
Yacht Club.
Yeah.
And they're going Game Boy Color era, I believe.
Super stoked. Yeah, they're inspired by the Game Boy Color era. So it looks like Link's Awakening mixed with like Castlevania kind of is the vibe I'm getting from that. So super excited for that game. That'll be an episode for sure when it comes out.
Yeah, we backed it at a tier.
I backed that game hard.
The intention, I backed it at like the $200 tier, thinking like, oh yeah, I definitely want to be a part of these developer casts that they're doing every month or so, and I haven't joined a single one.
They always do them while I'm at work. I joined like one, but it's always like I want to get on this one, and then I've got like a meeting or something that I have to go to instead. And I'm like, So it's always just being an adult is hard, you guys.
Well, I wanted to learn how to be a game developer, and I thought this would get my toes wet, and I didn't do it. But the point is that we backed it at a tier where we'll at least be in the credits.
Yeah. So that's super exciting.
That's all we've got going on.
Thanks for including me in that, guys.
Well, I mean, it was like 2 years ago. It was a while ago. Yeah.
At least
I had a job 2 years ago.
Yeah. I don't know what was going on. I think I probably texted both of you. I very rarely text just Shan. I usually text both of you guys.
Yeah, you probably.
Anyways,
Tucker doesn't.
And Tucker was like, I don't want to. Yeah.
Oh, I'm 3 texts behind. I can't go back.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm too far behind. I'll never catch up. They sent 4 whole text messages while I was gone.
The scroll feature on my phone
every
doesn't
time.
work.
The scroll feature on my phone doesn't work. Oh,
it's
man.
like Michael Scott. I was never given a name.
I was never given a name. Well, before we move on to the end thing here, I do want to give special shout out to the music in Bloodstained. It's very, very catchy, very old school Castlevania, and that's because it was composed by Michiru Yamane, which I'm pretty sure I pronounced wrong, but was also an ex-Konami person. They did a lot of music for some of the old school Castlevania titles, and so they were able to come on and compose the music for Bloodstained Curse of the Moon as well, which is super cool. Really great music. Lots of classic Castlevania music is very like I'm pretty sure that's why all of the Castlevania characters in the old school games have that like weird walk that they do. It's because they're listening to the music and they're like, huh, and they're just marching around. Like it's just very like bob your head kind of a music, which you wouldn't think from like a game about vampires and wolfmen and stuff like that. But it's very catchy, very upbeat, but also kind of like haunting at the same time. Very, very weird kind of a genre of music, but I really dig it. It's really good music. Super, super solid stuff. So playtime, as I mentioned before, for this game is going to run you about 2 hours, but to see all of the endings and get the full story out of the game, you probably going to end up playing through the game about 3 to 5 times. It's available. It was originally available on Nintendo 3DS, which is kind of crazy. Nintendo Switch, PS4, PS Vita, Windows, and Xbox One, and is a whopping $9.99. So not a bad deal.
Did PS Vita still exist?
I guess so, because listen, when I was doing my research, I checked Wikipedia and then I also separately Googled it, and it said PS Vita both times. So I have no reason to not believe that that's true.
It's one of 3 games on it.
Yeah.
For the 4 people that have one.
I never had a PS Vita, and I got one from like a scrap box, and I was going to fix it up because I think it's just something like with the battery or whatever. But then I found out that it was like there were 3 models, 1 2000 and 3000, and I got like the 1000. Then I found out the superior one is the 3000 because it's OLED, and it's like, well, I need the
Why even
OLED.
bother? Obviously.
Also, how is that the first handheld that ever had an OLED? It was ahead of its time. That's impressive.
It's all about the games. Doesn't matter how cool the hardware is. You got to have games.
Oh. I'm also afraid of like, okay, my collecting right now is almost strictly Nintendo. If I break out of that, it's gonna
it's game over.
Opens up a whole new world of things that'll destroy your wallet. Yeah.
Sega Genesis, PS1. Like if I go back that far, I'm dead.
Yeah.
I'll never have
you got to cut it off at a certain point or it just becomes a problem.
The thing about like collecting Nintendo though is like their cartridges are very chunky, very nostalgic, and so like collecting CDs, that's not really gonna do it for me.
It's not the same. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to display a CD.
Yeah. I would maybe get the Resident Evil series on CD, but like even then it's like, well, all of them release on GameCube at some point, and
and the Japanese GameCube boxes are amazing.
Oh yeah, Japanese. Listen, for all of the Resident Evil series, the Japanese box art is way cooler. It's always way cooler.
Biohazard. I don't know. If that's how they say it.
That was perfect Japanese, Shan. I felt like I was in Japan. Yeah.
It wasn't racist how I said it because I was trying to be respectful of how they might say it.
Yes, that's the difference. That's the distinction. It was culturally sensitive because
racism is all about intent.
Racism is 90% intent. Let's lock it down here. 10%, you could just be racist no matter what you say or do. So maybe be a little culturally sensitive of what you're about to say before you say it.
All right. Anyways. I think that'll do it for us today, you guys. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Eric's Indie Corner. Please listen to we do our regular episodes on every Monday, and Eric's Indie Corner episodes come out on Thursdays. You can find our stuff on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Please like, comment, subscribe, tell your friends. If you like what we're doing, leave us a comment. If you have fun ideas of something you want us to do differently, let us know. Leave us a comment as well for that. Also, check us out on Instagram. I play a game called Daily Dadish, which is another episode or another game I covered on Eric's Indie Corner. And check out my Daily Dadish scores. And if you can beat them, drop it in the comments. Let me know your scores. I'd love to compete with you guys. It'd be super fun. So thanks so much for joining us today. Had a great time talking about Bloodstained, and we'll catch you next time.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Outro. Bleep-a-doof, bleep-a-deep, bloop-a-dee-blow.